This week's EMOM Aesthetic, we're going to be talking about the differences and similarities between the deadlift, the straight leg deadlift, and the RDL. Now, when we start to look at these things, if you have an untrained eye, you may see RDL or straight leg deadlift written in your program. We see it all the time. People turn their videos in, it says straight leg deadlift, stiff leg deadlift, and they start doing RDLs. It says RDL, and we see them going all the way to the floor. Or we may even see a deadlift written into the workout, and what we see in a start position is more of a stiff-legged deadlift than an actual deadlift. So these progressions and how we go about these all have different purposes. As a main focus lift, the deadlift is always going to be how we gauge full body strength, movement patterns, a deep hinge, how we're able to access our glutes, drive weight off the floor, keeping a flat back, stabilizing our spine. That's a focus lift always. The stiff-legged deadlift and the RDL are both going to be accessory lifts to the deadlift. But when we start to look at how these two start to look alike and ways that they start to get confused by a lot of people, we start on the floor for the deadlift and the stiff-legged deadlift. Now, when we address the bar for both of them, we're going to have our feet underneath our hips, so we're able to drive straight up. Our hips are going to push back. Our hands are going to be just outside of our shins. And one way that we like to think about how we set up for a deadlift, and we can tell that our hips are in a good place for a deadlift, is that our knees are going to be touching our elbow pits. That's typically a really good indicator of the alignment of where your hamstrings, your hips, your knees, and your shins are located with the bar. So when we address it, we're going to pull our hips down, and now our back's tight, our core is on, engaged, and we're able to drive straight up off the ground, and that's going to be our basic deadlift. Now, that looks very similar. If you deadlift and you may have your hips a little bit lower in a squatting position, that can appear to be more of a stiff-legged deadlift if you have your shins back and they're more vertical. Depending upon kind of where your setup is, what you feel comfortable with, there's a little bit of a flexibility in where your hips can be. However, when we elevate our hips into a stiff-legged deadlift, we want to actually be putting a nice stretch on our hamstrings. So we're going to be setting up in the same manner, and this is where a lot of the confusion kicks in. But instead of pulling our hips down where our elbows are right in line with our elbow pits here, we're going to be pushing our hips higher. So our back is actually going to be almost flat to the ground, parallel to the ground, instead of pulled into that kind of Z formation or in a more angled lightning bolt type shape. So in the stiff-legged deadlift, the knees are going to track back behind the elbows. So our deadlift setup is here. Knees are pretty much in line with the elbows. A stiff-legged deadlift, we're going to raise. There's going to be a big stretch in the hamstring, nice flat back, and we pull straight up. On the way down, the bar comes all the way to the ground. There's slight flexion in the knee. And we're pulling a lot we're pushing the hips through, but a lot of the initiation off the floor is pulling with the hamstrings and getting those hips to drive through the bar when we finish with the hip extension and squeezing our glutes. Things really start to get crazy when we add in Romanian deadlifts. And the reason is because they look so familiar, especially from the hip down. The difference really just is the finish position. So for the stiff-legged deadlift, we start. Our back is very flat, parallel to the ground. The bar is in tight. We're squeezing our butt and we come straight up. That's going to be our finish position on the way back down. Nice and flat, legs stay straight all the way to the ground. In the RDL, we're only going to below our knees. So we're going to be keeping tension on the hamstrings through a shortened range of motion. And then once we get above the knee, it turns into a big glute movement where we extend our hips and drive our hips towards the bar. But the RDL is always a partial movement to just below the knee. As we stand this thing up, this is going to be our position just below the knee, weights in our midfoot, and driving straight up. Down and drive straight up. A couple things with the RDL that I tend to see is that people put too much focus on keeping their weight back in their heels versus staying in their midfoot. And this is really important because when you shift back here and you have a loaded barbell in front of you, it's really easy to counterbalance the weight versus being in your midfoot and forcing the musculature to actually move the weight effectively. The difference is that when we're counterbalancing, we just kind of fall back, but we lose that tension. When we shift that weight into the midfoot, we've got our weight is fully distributed throughout our foot. Now, even this position right here is very challenging on the hamstrings, a big stretch, and drive up. We use the RDL as a partial movement because we want to practice the top half of deadlift. Many people struggle off the floor more than they struggle above the knee. So the weight is lighter above the knee versus off the floor. That means that if you can pull 400 pounds in an RDL, you could probably do 450, or you could do 400 for a set of 5, because that position for you is much stronger. It's much larger musculature, and that hinge is just a better position, and you're not moving it throughout the full range. Typically above the knee, people are just stronger. So you can do higher reps, higher load with the RDL than you can off the floor. That's why we practice, because we still want to have a very strong lockout and be able to keep good position, but at the same time, the floor is the limiting factor for so many people, so you have to get down there and practice that with heavy load. In the EMOM aesthetics workouts, we love to program all of these. We program the deadlift as a focus lift. We have the stiff leg deadlift for additional hamstring and glute and upper back. And then we use the RDL as a partial movement to make sure that your lockout's strong and that you're building the core musculature, stabilizing your spine, and getting a massive hamstring stretch and that contraction. The other piece that we love about the RDL is that you get a really nice eccentric phase to that, versus typically when people go to the floor, they lose the bar and they just kind of bounce it off the ground if they're doing multiple reps, or they lose tension towards the bottom just because that's the end of the range of motion. The end of the range of motion in the RDL is actually where things get really difficult, that big stretch, and where you have to drive your knees forward. EMOM Aesthetics is in the description. 20-minute workouts, EMOM style, hypertrophy focused, for people that are busy as hell and don't have 60 to 90 minutes to waste time in the gym in between sets on their phone chasing Instagram. You can use the code Shrugged. Make sure you get in the description, EMOM Aesthetics. That's